Hi everyone, it's Raina. So this video is looking at the astrological chart of Kurt Cobain. Somebody requested this. I think a couple of people have requested it. And so I finally broke down and said, okay, I'll do it because when Nirvana came out, first came out in the beginning of the 90s, I remember I would look at these, Billboard top 10 songs or whatever, and I would see that song, Smells Like Teen Spirit. Or I had like a book on the Billboard charts, and I would look and I'd say, gosh, what is this? I would hear about it, but I never actually heard the song. I don't know, because I was listening to the radio, but not the kind of stations, I guess, that would have it. But I did eventually, like in the early 90s, become familiar with some of the songs that were more well known. And I actually liked them. But, that wasn't necessarily my thing, grunge overall. I listened to Pearl Jam as well. And I did like songs from the grunge era. I think the early 90s was a renaissance of sorts in the rock genre. And, I think there was a little bit of a wasteland in the late 80s, with hair metal. And then the early 90s, I think it started to get good again for a while. And so anyway, I know of him, and I know a little bit of, some of the main things. I kind of looked on Wikipedia for some of his upbringing. And I actually, one of the things that I wanted to say is that I'm surprised that he was born on February 20th. I thought he would be like really into maybe even March, but he's really on the cusp with Aquarius because his sun was only 1 degree of Pisces. But I mean, he has so much water, it's not even funny. And all of his personal planets are water, even his some of the outer ones. Jupiter's in Cancer, Saturn is in Pisces. Yikes. Neptune is in Scorpio. Chiron is in Pisces. So it's just like unbelievable. And one of the things that I just want to remind people is that we don't really know how he died. And this is super important because I honestly feel like even if somebody, like, you can say, oh yes, like somebody like John Lennon got shot to death. We can all agree on that. But who actually killed him? And you might say, oh, you're such a conspiracy theorist. No, I'm a conspiracy realist. And the thing is that, why is that important? Well, it is important because we want to, like Marilyn Monroe. How did Marilyn Monroe die? Did she get murdered, or did she die of an overdose? Because something, or whatever, any kind of self-destructive reasons to die, because it can change the narrative very quickly. I saw some footage of Kurt Cobain, and I really wasn't familiar with any interviews with him or anything like that. And I was absolutely floored at how articulate he was, there was just something about him he seemed like a highly intelligent person. And, seeing all this water, I would even expect he would present himself differently that way. Oh, one thing about him is that he was Virgo rising, which means that he was ruled by Mercury. So there's your intelligence. Not to say that water signs aren't intelligent, but the way that they express themselves can be quite different. So I had I had like a stereotype, and that's what I'm talking about in terms of like how somebody dies, because you can kind of almost dismiss them as, oh, wow, they were just like a junkie. They were very depressed. They were this and they were that. And that might be 100% true, but it doesn't mean that what they said is necessarily how it went. And, very interestingly, when I was looking at Wikipedia, they said he was treated for this drug. I guess it was supposedly a drug dependency and was called Rohypnol. I think it's called Rohypnol. Now, I was thinking, I've heard of this drug before, and I flashed on Michael Jackson, and I think he was on this drug, and they said he was on this drug, that he was prescribed it because it was a sedative. I think they used it in surgery um, to really knock somebody out. It's like, that stuff that they use. And I think they were claiming that Michael Jackson had a very bad case of insomnia, or whatever else he was on. It was just like creating that kind of like wakefulness. But here's the thing, from what I understand, you can't just get that even on the black market. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you can get anything on the black market. But I just wonder if these things were coming from, the medical establishment on the directive of somebody else. So just keep that in mind when you hear about a celebrity's death. Matthew Perry, any of these people, did they really die the way that they said they died, of an overdose or self-inflicted, whatever you want to call it, like their own self-destructive tendencies? Or was it something that was made to seem that way? You can have a terrible addiction and still not be the cause of your own death. So just keep that in mind. So I'm kind of wondering about that. I'm going to talk about his possible emotional state, his artistic abilities. It's not going to be that long of a video because I don't have a lot to draw from in terms of like how I'm going to observe, my observations of his life, because I don't know that much about it. Even knowing about Wikipedia, that's not enough to do like a very advanced analysis. But his sun was in Pisces and moon in Cancer. His Mercury in Pisces, his Venus in Pisces, his Mars in Scorpio. So he had all three of the water signs represented, and then Virgo rising. And what this can mean to me is the sun and the rising signs. If the rising sign is quite different from the sun sign in terms of what, these are opposing signs. His sun and rising did not form oppositions though. But what that can lead to is a person who is the polar opposite of how they kind of present themselves. So yeah, I mean, I suppose you could say with an earth ascendant that the person may present themselves as they're totally like grounded and rational, and they might be quite irrational with, very strong emotional nature that they don't show to the world sometimes. And one of the things that I gathered from him, and I think I already knew this because I believe I read a Rolling Stone interview once of his where he touched upon some of these themes about growing up in a working class family. His mother was a waitress. His father was like a car mechanic. And when you grow up that way, and he grew up in Washington State, and I can't speak about Washington State. I've never lived in the Pacific Northwest. It seems like a very liberal environment, but I know that there are always pockets of more conservative residents and things like that. So I don't know. I don't want to speculate about the town. Okay, I just looked it up on Wikipedia, and apparently this was a logging town that then became, dried out or whatever you want to call it. They cut down all the trees, I don't know, by the 80s, by the time, the late 80s. So that would have been around the time when he maybe things were kind of winding down. But I can see here when they talk about the demographics, median household income of $50,000. That's not so low. There's a lot worse than that. But 21% of the population lives at or below the poverty line. So that suggests that there might be something that might be economically depressed. Now, this is very interesting because I did pull up his Wikipedia again, and one of the things that I was a little bit confused about, they said when his parents divorced when he was 9 years old, that he was embarrassed by his family, and I was like, why? I was like, it didn't connect. But then I see here that they said that he wanted to have a typical family, but he mentioned security, and I was like, well, that's strange because he was a very defiant young person after that, and I forgot that he has the moon in Cancer. Cancer is the ruler of the fourth house of home and family, and is a traditional sign. So that security, but also the tradition of a two-parent household, I could see. But in addition to that, now this is very interesting. He has Uranus in the 12th house. Uranus in the 12th can be the person who is afraid to be different, is afraid to be a nonconformist. Uranus forms a conjunction with the ascendant from the 12th house side. But, based on the things that he did when he was younger, I don't think that that is the case. They said that he got bullied when he was on a wrestling team, which he didn't want to be involved in sports, and I'm not surprised with all this water. I could see some, like for males, it does seem like there are a lot who are into sports, but some aren't. The ones that tend to be more sensitive, they tend to be more interested in artistic pursuits. Apparently, he was good at wrestling, but he deliberately allowed himself to be pinned because he wanted to, negatively impact his father. And I wonder, I guess his father put him in Little League, and he struck out on purpose to avoid playing. So he was doing this to sabotage that and probably piss his father off or rebel against his father in that way. But what we can see beyond that is not beyond the rebellious aspect of that, is that his father seems like that typical man who was into sports, and his father was the coach. So then you also are talking about probably that kind of power struggle. And these kinds of things are important because Pisces is a mutable water sign, and this means that Pisces people tend to be very malleable. They tend to be easy to kind of shape or influence. And that's why who he surrounded himself with was of prime importance, who he allowed into his inner orbit. And unfortunately, he probably wasn't a good judge of character, because a lot of Pisces aren't. And that led him to, if you're of the camp that think that Courtney Love was bad for him, then that would include her. But maybe someday I'll do her chart. I don't know. Another thing that happened that was the result of the divorce is that both of his parents ended up remarrying. I'm trying to think of okay. So, or you could say like, just they recoupled with new people. And that was something that probably bothered him because he wanted his parents to be together. Again, when you have the moon in Cancer, male or female, you're going to be very sensitive. And he was at an age, he was 9 years old, where that was super young. I think if he had been a teenager, it might have been slightly different. But at that age, it really does feel like your world is being torn apart. But having a moon in Cancer will make you extra sensitive. And of course, the sun in Pisces, definitely that too. So his family took him to a therapist when he started bullying another boy. And the therapist said that it would be better if it was just like one family in his environment. And so there was an attempt for his parents to reconcile, but it didn't work. And so he eventually started living, because he was getting out of control. So he started living with this born again Christian family, and he actually, according to Wikipedia, became a devout Christian. Now, Pisces, Pisces is a very spiritual sign. One thing I will say about all of these Pisces, and even, Cancer and Scorpio, is that they can be very psychic. But I would say Pisces is tops for that. And having Pluto in the 12th house, this is kind of that scorpionic sort of insight into psychological dynamics of human nature. So he was probably on multiple fronts very, very highly sensitive and aware and psychic to his environment. And going into a fundamentalist home, to me, and actually converting, or it's not a conversion, but taking it up, doesn't surprise me, because his sun is in Pisces. However, he actually then renounced it later. And they say here in Wikipedia that he began to do anti-God rants. So almost like he became going from one extreme to the other, almost like atheistic types of things. But one of the sentences after that I thought was very interesting, I go, however, spirituality remained an important part of Cobain's personal life and beliefs. And that's how I would, that's what I would expect for a Pisces individual. He actually also, as I stated earlier, had Mercury and Venus in Pisces. Venus is exalted in Pisces, by the way. And so it's considered at its peak or strongest in Pisces. But I feel that because of the nature of Pisces, that it can still be problematic to have Venus in Pisces. And it can lead a person to choosing unwisely in love. He actually had a very well aspected Neptune, which is the ruler of Pisces. Trines from Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, and Jupiter and Saturn to Neptune, and a sextile, which is another friendly angle, from Uranus to Neptune. The only thing that was a hard angle, he had an in conjunction with his midheaven, but forget about that. His sun squared off to Neptune. So there was definitely some sort of identity crisis that he had. I suspect, I have no clue if this is accurate at all, that because of his total water placements in his inner planets, that he might have been susceptible to psychic attacks, and that may have hijacked him to some maybe lower astral entities, which can also, by the way, be connected with addiction. When you engage in intoxication, you can invite these in, but also maybe the other way, which is that you already are open because you have this going on, and or especially when in substance abuse can be more likely because you're being urged to engage in that, the lower astral entities. That could lead to, it's kind of like being possessed in a way, you could say. That's really what possession is. And I don't think possession is always like Linda Blair. I think it can show up in many different ways. Like the person who has a supposedly bad temper, and sometimes they even black out. They don't even remember. And I'm not talking about after drinking, I'm just talking about in general. However, the person who drinks and they turn into this monster, to me, that can be the lower astral influence, them coming in and kind of possessing the person and affecting their behavior, affecting their thoughts, and affecting their actions. So that's one of the, if you want to call it, so-called dangers of having a lot of water in your personal points, is that you may be susceptible to this. And this is not to scare anybody and say, oh my God, I'm going to be possessed. What I would say first and foremost is to be very mindful of this possibility and to do everything you can to kind of discourage it from abstaining from intoxicants, from being very pristine in your energy and energetic field, like what you watch, what you listen to, what you allow into your life, the people you allow into your life, because I think it can all impact that. But one of the things that they were saying was that he started attending these punk rock shows when he was a teenager, and yet he was into the Beatles and more melodic music earlier on. So was it this kind of artistic thing where maybe his lower nature, or what he had allowed himself to be absorbed, to absorb him, was due to those darker emotions, and he had like the light side and the dark side. Did he have bipolar disorder? Maybe there's a possibility. I don't see anything in particular. The only aspect his moon makes is to Mercury, and it's a trine. But I would say, and I'm talking about the moon, like usually it's like the moon opposing Pluto, that you see the bipolar traits, but he does have Mercury opposing Uranus, so that could indicate shifting. The polarity is the opposition. So, he has both oppositions from Mercury to Uranus and Mercury to Pluto. A Mercury contact with Pluto, a hard angle, can be obsessive thoughts. I would say especially anything hard, but even the conjunction, I think, can be interpreted as a hard angle. Whoa, I just looked it up. I just put Kurt Cobain dyslexia. I can't believe this. Because he has Neptune in the third house. That's why I did so. And they have, now they have an AI overview, which I'd rather not indulge AI, but it's the first thing up. What they said was that there was no proof on a definitive level that he did have it, but they said that there was some sort of knowledge that he struggled with his writing and his reading. And that, to me, definitely suggests that it's something like that. Because if you know about dyslexia, you know that it's transposing letters. So, of course, that's going to affect not only reading, but writing, too. And they also said he was diagnosed with bipolar. disorder as well as ADHD. And they said that he had mood swings, depression. Um, and I heard that he dropped out of school. I'm assuming, I don't know what, let me see what year. Maybe they might not even say what year it was. Wow. I guess his mom gave him an ultimatum when he was a sophomore. Um, no, that's wrong. He began living with her when he was a sophomore, and she gave him an ultimatum when he was about to graduate. So he basically finished high school. He dropped out 2 weeks before graduation because he didn't have enough credits. Oh my God. And his mother, demanded that he find an employment or leave the house, and so he left. So you could say he went to high school the whole time, basically. So the point is that this can also affect a person's self-esteem. I have a background in education, although I never became an actual teacher, but I have a background I observed in classrooms, and I feel like, so if you have Neptune in the third house, you may be somebody who needs to learn in a different sort of way. I think it's probably a lot better these days where there's more open-mindedness instead of trying to lump everybody together and expect everybody to learn at the same pace and with the same types of styles of learning. So maybe it has improved. So it might be more individualistic now. But yeah, this is very important in terms of his formative years. If he felt that he didn't, measure up academically or intellectually, then that's problematic. And also another thing about ADHD that's important to understand, besides just not being able to concentrate that much or sit still, is that the person might act impulsively and not really think things out before they do something. And this, can really wreak havoc on one's choices that they make. They might make some choices that are not the best. But again, with these astral influences, the third house is the mind, and Neptune is without boundaries. So, yes, that can be problematic, Don't always believe the thoughts you think. Maybe he had that kind of hijacking. And, who knows if disassociation could have accompanied this with all that Pisces, the water. I could totally see something like that. Not saying like a full-blown schizophrenic, but maybe having periods of time where he kind of was out. And that also could indicate that there were, it can leave a person open to influences of not such a great nature. Interestingly enough, his sun is in the sixth house, which can be the person who's actually has a very strong work ethic and might be very organized. I mean, I don't know if this is in any way true of him, but you have to admit that anybody who takes the time to create, in this case, write songs and somehow, put them before the public, they have to exhibit consistency, and they have to have the ability to, take it to the next level. His Mercury was here as well, so it does also indicate maybe doing work of a cerebral nature. If he hadn't gone into music, he might have been a writer. His midheaven was Gemini. There might have been something else that he ended up doing that had an intellectual component to it. Maybe even maybe something in the media, even. I just thought he had a very nice voice and a presence. He was a handsome man. I did see a film of him when he was under the influence of maybe heroin or something. And, so I know that he did have that side to him. I'm not saying that. But I was, the way, I don't know, the way that I thought his life was just, he was just like a complete junkie. Because I see people when I'm out and about who are junkies and stuff, and a lot of times they're just very far gone. I'm talking about even the young ones where they're not that lucid, and he seemed very lucid. But his sun squares Neptune from the 6th, so you're talking about the 3rd to the 6th, or the 6th to the 3rd. And what's interesting about that is you have this solid, practical placement of the sun in the 6th house, but then it's forming a hard angle coming from the 3rd, which is the mind. So that may have been the downfall, is that his thoughts or his consciousness, that's why I said about disassociation, something that made it so that he couldn't just stay grounded, which the 6th house would have represented, and maybe kept to those routines. And that may have been the downfall. In the 7th house of committed partnership, but also the 7th house can be legal matters. I don't know if he had any, I don't know about his daughter, if they took her away. I know there was something like that. I'm not really I'm going to get into that rabbit hole, but just telling you that there are legal affairs that are connected to the 7th house, but also public relations, or maybe, how one's actions affect how one is seen. Maybe that's what public relations can mean too. So anyway, he had Venus, Saturn, and Chiron in this house. His Venus and Saturn form a conjunction. So it goes without saying that this indicates somebody who is very dedicated to the one that they love. And because this is in the house of relationships, it says to me that there's a good chance that they would never initiate a divorce or separation, that it would be the other party. And so I don't know about Kurt and his relationship, or her. Yeah, I looked it up, and their daughter was taken away from them after she was born because, Courtney admitted that she had taken heroin, but she said, and when she was first pregnant, but she kind of like went back and forth and all of that. So they took away the baby and stuff. I remember that back then, something like that happening. So one thing, because I paused this and I was reading more from Wikipedia, I want to talk about his sexuality, because when I was talking about that square from the sun to Neptune, that is like an identity crisis. And one of the biggest things that I think about is being gay, and also about Uranus in the 12th house. That can be, like I said, somebody who is afraid to be a nonconformist. Now, of course, he was able to do that to a large extent. He was able to kind of go against the norms of society, but maybe that was the third rail for him. That was the last one. They said that in a magazine interview, they asked him if he was gay, and he said that if he wasn't attracted to Courtney, that he would be bisexual. Okay, well, if a man says that, I'm going to take that as the truth. See, when he was in high school, he befriended a gay student because that like kind of like made him be because he was bullied himself and he even bullied another boy. So he wanted to just kind of like not be like on the radar of the other kids, and that was his way of like kind of like going underground by hanging with this gay kid who might have been ostracized himself, I'm assuming. I'm not sure. And remember, I'm recording this in 2025. This kind of thing is probably not the case in most areas where being gay is a thing, but this was back then. He was born in 1967. So we're talking about in the 80s when he was dealing with high school and stuff like that. So that would have been a lot different time frame. Now, and he would write God is gay, like he would do, what do you call it, graffiti and stuff like that. He would say everyone is gay. I'm just saying Jesus is gay. That these are things that I'm taking this from Wikipedia. So, this is a liner note that he had in an album that came. I never heard of this album that came out. I'm thinking it was around 1993, called Insecticide. And it said, if any of you in any way hate homosexuals, people of different color or women, please do this one favor for us. Leave us the fuck alone. Don't come to our shows and don't buy our records. And I'm assuming he wrote that himself. Now, think about that. This is like decades ago. This is the kind of thing that you would see today all over the place. But then that was not the thing. This is like woke. Okay, so he had that side to himself. And of course, I really do believe this has to do with the Pisces, which is about loving unconditionally, Venus and Pisces in particular. Being on the cusp with Aquarius. Aquarius is very much about, or having Uranus on having a conjunction between Uranus and the ascendant, even if it's coming from the 12th house, that kind of thing. Which is like, people have the right to be different. Okay. Now, I just realized when I was kind of going through this about talking about his death, but also his mental health, is that, he was using drugs from an early age, and I'm including alcohol in that. And so, of course, that's going to affect somebody's emotional state. And so, interestingly, his North Node was in Taurus of all signs, which is so, and actually in Taurus's domain, the second house, he has Mars. So it's kind of strange to me because it makes me wonder if when he used the word security, talking about his parents divorcing, if that also could apply to his financial security, if maybe he kind of tapped into something that he knew would be very, that would resonate with young, disaffected people, but there was also that commercial angle to it. It's interesting that I don't know if Smells Like Teen Spirit was his first hit, but I mean, that's even the name of a brand of deodorant. So that kind of like almost suggests give them what they want, more than artistic exploration in a sense. But the fact that his North Node is in the 8th house, I wouldn't necessarily say that has anything to do with the manner of death, nor is the eighth house can be, death. But the fact that the North Node is our destiny could mean that his destiny was that his death was a part of his legacy. And that maybe, and then, he would just increase in stature after his death. Going back to the seventh house of committed partnership, he had Saturn, Venus, and Chiron. Chiron, the wounded healer, actually in Pisces in this house. And, does he have a conjunction between... Yes, he has a conjunction between Venus and Chiron in the seventh. So I think that there's a definite possibility that he viewed Courtney as his savior in a sense. Definitely, I don't know if they had a tumultuous relationship at all, but I just feel like there is that kind of, that you could even call it the soulmate type of vibe going on there. I know some people might have at me in the comments. That's fine if you do, because I know that there is some cloud of suspicion over her, although sometimes that can be, sometimes I wonder how much of that is sexism versus actual suspicion. I think, I think there's something to be said. It's same thing happened with Yoko, but, like I said, sometimes there are these little inconvenient truths that make you, things that make you go, too. So it's kind of weird. But in any case, he had Saturn here, and they say do not marry. If you have Saturn in the seventh, don't marry before your first Saturn return. I do believe he got married in his 20s. I don't think he lived to be... Yeah, he's part of the 27 club, isn't he? That's another thing that makes it a little bit tricky, because Brian Jones, another Pisces, they actually say that he was murdered. And, the typical thing was, poor Brian, he had such a substance abuse problem, and he took drugs, and then he passed out when he was in the pool or something like that, instead of getting held underwater by a contractor who didn't want to pay up or whatever it was, something out of revenge or that. So the bottom line is that I don't know how much of that plays into anything, but the reason for the Saturn comment is because, when you have your first Saturn return, that's when you start to grow up and you start to assume responsibility. So what they're saying is that you might be trying, maybe in some cases, to feel protected. Like a woman who has Saturn in the seventh may marry a very young and older man, or, an older person, I guess you could say any gender, but I'm saying specifically a man, because she's trying to escape a bad home life or something along those lines. So that's kind of an interesting take. And I think I don't know if I've ever heard this said, but I think it could definitely be true. Since Saturn is the Lord of Karma, that the marriage could be karmic. Karmic doesn't mean bad, though. It just, that's, when you have that conjunction between Venus and Chiron, it could be like the soulmate, but it could be something that is, coming from this fated necessity, but maybe it's something that is kind of playing out old patterns. You never know. And I think Chiron in the seventh can be responsible for that, when talking about public relations, is this idea of, him as a victim, because Chiron has like Piscean tendencies, or the suffering of a person. And looking at the 10th house of career, he had the moon and Jupiter. Jupiter here can be both in Cancer, by the way, with his midheaven in Gemini. And I just, in case, because I pause a lot when I do readings, so in case I didn't complete my thought with the midheaven, I was talking in Gemini, I said becoming an educator, but maybe even like somebody in the media, because I thought he had a very nice voice and he seemed highly intelligent. The moon in the 10th house can certainly be any kind of creative field. They say like you can develop this. So I always thought that the sun in the 10th meant celebrity, and I suppose it could mean like somebody who's famous. And you have the sun in the 10th house. It's a sign of a leader. But I thought it meant, just like fame in general. But actually, I think the moon in the 10th might be more fame because it's the emotions. And when somebody is a fan, they, they have this emotion towards that person. It's kind of like they're emotionally investing in that person or emotionally relating to that person. And the 10th house is at the top of the chart. So it's the person's status or place in the world. Sometimes it can also be that the person has a large female following. I don't necessarily think that was the case with Kurt, because I think grunge was kind of masculine. And I know there were females who were into it. Of course, Courtney was the female version of it. But I'm just saying that I have a belief, wouldn't they do in his concerts, like, what was it called? Like, body, what is it called? Crowd surfing or diving, body diving or whatever. And it seemed like that because he went to a lot of punk concerts where they were already doing that. Of course, what's his face was doing it in the 70s. Iggy Pop, so that was nothing new. And I'm sure during with the Sex Pistols. It just seems like more of a masculine thing, but what can I say? But yeah, definitely anything that is creative. And Jupiter, I mean, just being lucky and being at the right place at the right time, doing things in the right era. Their first album, Bleach, was released in June of 1989, and it didn't really. It actually did better in UK than it did in America. It got to 33, and in the US only 89. It did sell almost 2 million units, 1,900,000, but that might be over time. But Nevermind came out in 1991, 11.5 million US, worldwide 30 million. So 1991 was an era that we had the alternative rock scene really take off. So in terms of Jupiter in the 10th house, I think that he was right on time with that, with what that represented. And he was, he was at that point, he was in his mid-20s by then. When he released or you could say his early 20s, I guess. But by the time he passed away, he had only been a big thing for a few years. So it just goes to show that with Jupiter, he came probably, very quickly once he made up his mind that that's what he wanted to do. And that might also speak for that kind of I wouldn't even just say popularity, but being renowned, well known. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there. I just wanted to kind of, I always say I'm going to just do a short video and then look, it's almost an hour. So I hope that you enjoyed this. And if you'd like a private reading, the link is below. Take care. Bye.